Imagine standing in the heart of the greatest city on Earth in the year 1858. London is the crown jewel of the British Empire. It is the center of global trade, finance, and power. But as you walk toward the River Thames, something isn't right. The air isn't just dusty or smoky from the coal fires. It is heavy. It is thick. It feels like a physical weight pressing against your lungs. This was the beginning of what history would forever remember as the Great Stink. For decades, London had been playing a dangerous game with its own waste. The population had exploded to nearly 3 million people. That is 3 million people eating, drinking, and inevitably producing waste. But the infrastructure was still stuck in the Middle Ages. There were no modern toilets. Every time a person used a chamber pot or a basic outdoor privy, that waste had to go somewhere. By 1858, that somewhere was the River Thames. The river was no longer a body of water. It was a slow-moving open-air sewer that wound its way through the very heart of the city. Before the Great Stink reached its peak, London relied on a disgusting profession known as the Nightsoil Men. These were workers who arrived at your house in the middle of the night to dig out your cesspool. A cesspool was essentially a giant hole in the ground beneath your house or in your backyard, where all your family's waste collected for months or even years. These holes frequently leaked, seeping through the floorboards and into the foundations of the homes. The Nightsoil Men would shovel this liquid filth into buckets and haul it away to be sold as fertilizer. It was a brutal, stomach-turning job. However, as the city grew, the demand for this fertilizer dropped, and the price of hiring a Nightsoil Man skyrocketed. People stopped cleaning their cesspools. They let them overflow. Eventually, the city decided to connect these overflowing pits to the existing rainwater drains. Those drains led directly to the Thames. In an attempt to solve the smell in the houses, they turned the entire river into a giant, citywide cesspool. The winter of 1857 had and milled, but the summer of 1858 was something else entirely. A massive heatwave struck the city in June. Temperatures soared to nearly 95 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. In a city built of brick and stone with no air conditioning, the heat was already unbearable. But the sun did something much worse than just make people sweat. It began to cook the river. The Thames was a tidal river, meaning it pushed back and forth twice a day with the ocean. This meant the waste wasn't actually flowing out to sea. It was just sloshing back and forth, fermenting under the blistering sun. The water turned a deep, sickly blackish brown. Huge bubbles of methane and hydrogen sulfide began to rise to the surface and pop, releasing a concentrated stench that could be smelled for miles. This wasn't just the smell of a dirty bathroom. This was the smell of millions of gallons of raw sewage, industrial chemicals from tanneries, and rotting animal carcasses from the slaughterhouses, all simmering in a giant pot. Life of the poorest Londoners during this time was unimaginably gross. On the banks of this rotting river lived the Mudlarks. These were often children, some as young as 5 years old, who would wade into the toxic Thames mud at low tide. They were looking for anything they could sell: scraps of coal, beats of copper, or even old bones. They spent their days waist-deep in the very sewage we are talking about, often with open cuts on their legs. If you think the smell was bad for the rich, imagine being a mudlark, breathing in those fumes at ground level. Then there were the watermen who operated ferries across the river. By June 1858, they were losing their jobs because passengers refused to get on a boat. The fumes were so strong they would cause people to faint mid. People reported that the water was so thick with solids that the oars of the boats would actually get stuck in the sludge. To understand why people were so terrified, you have to understand how they thought disease worked. In the 1850s, the germ theory we know today didn't exist in the public mind. Most people believed in Miasma Theory. They believed that diseases like cholera and typhoid were caused by bad air or foul smells. To the average Londoner, the Great Stink wasn't just a nuisance. They believed the smell itself was a death sentence. People would walk through the streets with handkerchiefs soaked in lavender or chloride of lime pressed against their faces. They were convinced that one deep breath of the Thames air would cause their lungs to fail or their blood to boil. The city was gripped by a secondary plague of fear. Every time a child got a fever or a man felt nauseous, the blame was placed squarely on the pestilential vapors rising from the mud banks of the river. In reality, the real killer was the water. People were still drinking from the same river they were dumping their waste into, leading to horrific outbreaks of cholera that would turn a healthy person into a blue-skinned corpse in less than 24 hours. The crisis reached its breaking point when the smell finally invaded the halls of power. The Houses of Parliament sit right on the banks of the Thames. The windows of the House of Commons were designed to let in the breeze, but in July 1858, that breeze was toxic. During one particularly hot afternoon session, the stench became so powerful that members of Parliament began to vomit into their handkerchiefs. They tried to soak the heavy curtains of the building in chloride of lime to neutralize the odor, but it did nothing. The smell of the chemicals mixed with the smell of the sewage to create an even more horrific scent. The politicians who had ignored the pleas of the poor for decades were finally feeling the consequences. Benjamin Disraeli, the Chancellor of the famously described the river as a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and intolerable horrors. For the first time in history, the British government was literally forced to consider evacuating the capital because they could unbreathe in their own offices. If the smell reached the Queen at Buckingham Palace, the city was truly doomed. It took a near collapse of the government to finally trigger action. Within a record-breaking 18 days, a bill was passed to fund a massive overhaul of the city's plumbing. The task fell to a brilliant but overworked engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. He knew that the only way to save London was to build a system that moved the waste far away from the city center before it hit the water. This was one of the greatest engineering feats of the Victorian era. Bazalgette designed 82 miles of massive main intercepting sewers and over 1,100 miles of street sewers. He used 380 million bricks and moved hundreds of thousands of tons of earth. He was obsessed with quality, insisting on using Portland cement, which was a relatively new and expensive material at the time, to ensure the tunnels wouldn't crumble. He basically rebuilt the entire underground foundation of London while the city was still living on top of it. The Great Stink ended as the weather cooled in late 1858, but the work Bazalgette started continued for years. His sewer system didn't just stop the smell, it effectively wiped out cholera in London. By moving the waste away from the drinking water intakes, he saved hundreds of thousands of lives without even fully realizing how germs worked. Interestingly, Bazalgette was so forward-thinking that he made the pipes much larger than they needed to be at the time. He calculated the population and then doubled the size of the pipes, just in case. Because of his foresight, those same Victorian sewers are still in use under the streets of London today. The Great Stink was a moment of peak grossness in human history, a literal river of waste that forced a superpower to its knees and changed the way we build cities forever. It serves as a disgusting reminder that when we ignore the basic needs of a city, nature has a very smelly way of fighting back. Thank you for watching. Hit like and subscribe to this channel for more untold stories.